Dobar dan, dobrodošli u još jedan kontekst. Moj današnji gost je pisac, novinar i nekadašnji britanski diplomata koji je dobar deo svoje karijere proveo upravo u regionu Zapadnog Balkana, ali i na Kosovu i to u Severnoj Mitrovici, što je jako retko da diplomate budu smeštene na severu Kosova. On danas živi u Beogradu, ali i dalje pomno prati odnose Beograda i Prištine. Kao diplomata pisao je o ovom regionu, pisao je i o severu Kosova, ali ne iz ugla geopolitike, već iz ugla narativa, ljudskih priča, ljudskih iskustava koje je skupljao upravo živeći na severu Kosova, a danas ima i novo zanimanje, on piše vinske vodiče, o svemu tome ćemo tokom razgovora. Moj gost je Bankroft. Dobar dan, dobrodošli u Kontekst.
Hvala puno.
Vi govorite srpski, ali po dogovoru razgovarat ćemo na engleskom.
Malo lakše na engleskom, ali sljedeći put možemo na srpskom.
Shvatam to kao obećanje, tako da sada ćemo preći na engleski. For starts, you can tell me why do you think that Kosovo issue and Serbian-Albanian relations cannot be understood without narratives, history, identity? Are those layers just as important as the politics?
I mean, the Kosovo for both communities plays an important role in their identity. For many Serbs, the history of Kosovo, the magnificent monasteries that I had the pleasure of visiting. I had Father Sava was very kind to invite me to sleep in Visoki Dečani this last January, and you can feel the majesty of these places. And so, Kosovo does go to the heart of how people feel about their sense of national identity, and therefore it's a very important element of the whole conversation. But I think more contemporary factors are equally, if not more relevant. I mean, for Serbs, there is that sense that Kosovo has been, that double standards have been applied when it comes to Kosovo. Von der Leyen the other day was talking about, the importance of upholding Ukraine's territorial integrity, for instance. And for many Serbs, that seems like an obvious contradiction, that Kosovo's declaration of independence or unilateral declaration of independence has been recognized by, most EU member states. And yet here we are trying to reinforce the importance of a rules-based order and applying that to Ukraine. And it creates a sense of grievance, whether you agree with that or not. It is a grievance that is held by many people. And of course, the more contemporary history for many Albanians, for most Albanians in Kosovo, the experience of discrimination under the Milosevic regime and the experience of the war towards the end of the 90s is very raw for people living in Serbia, NATO's bombardment. These are raw emotions, many of which, 30 years is not a long time in this sense. I think there are a lot of unresolved traumas that make it very difficult for people to consider, objectively, coldly, rationally, how to move forward, how to find compromises, how to find solutions. And of course, any solution will require giving up something to get something in return. So I think, also in Pristina, there's a sense of grievance about how Kosovo is dealt with by the EU, for instance. When it came to visa liberalization, they achieved what was asked of them. They weren't awarded visa liberalization. For many, they interpret that as almost akin to a form of Islamophobia, that, with the far right rising in Europe, being skeptical about, Muslims coming to their country, they feel this as an additional form of discrimination, let alone the persistence, the existence of the five non-recognizers. So you find those grievances on each side of the debate that feed into how Kosovo is discussed.
Serbian-Albanian relations are not just a theory for you. You talk based on great experience. You worked for EULEX in Mitrovica. So how did you first come to Kosovo and what made you stay here? You're based in Belgrade now?
Yeah, I traveled through the region. I've been based in the region for about 20 years, working for international organizations like the OSCE and as you say, EULEX in Kosovo. I've also worked in the non-profit, non-governmental organization section. I was managing a UK government-funded peace-building project between Kosovo and Serbia. So I've had the privilege of working on both sides of the equation in that sense. And yeah, when I lived in North Kosovo, my work entailed getting out and meeting people, understanding their security concerns, visiting the monasteries, Sokolica, Banjska, going to municipalities like Zubin Potok and Leposavic and listening to people about, how Kosovo's independence and the green border boundary areas, the crossing points, how their daily lives have been impacted. Talking to people from the university in the north, talking to all manner of people, politicians.
How much time did you spend in kafanas?
I mean, people here like to do business in public. In trust is very important, building up relationships. I lived in the north, so I think the simple fact of being seen around town helps people build a familiarity with, so that when you sit down to talk about something more serious, you have that pre-existing relationship in place. I think that is very important for people. I found the same reality in Bosnia and Herzegovina. When I worked in Brčko, one of the best pieces of advice I received was when a former predecessor explained which cafes were sort of occupied by which political party. So if you wanted to go and talk to SNSD, you would go there. If you wanted to talk to HDZ, you would go there. I mean, these are the realities of how you do sort of local politics in that sense.
You said that your job was a great privilege for you. So how much did the years you spent in the north of Kosovo shape your understanding of Serb-Albanian relations?
Well, I've spent 4 years there, and I think,
From 2015,
from 2015 to the end of
2018.
2018. And it's quite easy to forget, given where we are now, just what sense of progress existed at that juncture. I worked on elements of integrating Serbian police, who once upon a time served for MUP and then went to serve for the Kosovo police. Judges and prosecutors were integrated at that juncture. Judges who once upon a time upheld and adjudicated on Serbian law were then integrated to adjudicate on Kosovo law. These were really fundamental steps.
But meanwhile, they left police.
They left it, yeah. Subsequently, obviously we've had, the withdrawal from institutions. The civil protection corps, the bridge watchers were disbanded. So there was the cooperation between chambers of commerce was very well developed. People were doing business. There was a sense of optimism. And I could see when we were discussing how to implement these agreements, you could see the levels of trust were such, and the levels of confidence were such, that things moved forward without too many impediments, because it was almost as if the two parties were on the same page in terms of the agreements and what would be implemented and where that would take them in the future.
And today, are the parties at the same page?
No, I mean, I think, the last, 5 or 6 years have seen a real breakdown. I think a lot of those, obviously you mentioned the withdrawal from institutions. Obviously we've seen a fundamental change in the policing presence in the north of Kosovo. But even in terms of dialogue, those personal relationships don't seem to exist anymore.
Having that in mind, when you see north of Kosovo, especially Mitrovica, the town where you used to live, is that the same town? So how much have things changed since the time you lived there?
No, I think there's been a fundamental change. I mean, you look at the number of, on the main pedestrian street, you look at the number of Albanian-owned businesses that have been set up. It's very interesting. When you talk to Serbs in Mitrovica, they have no objections to shopping in Albanian-owned stores when in the south. Many Serbs would travel across the East Bridge to ETC shopping center. But this now, given the breakdown of trust, is viewed more in terms of a sort of economic occupation. In my book, I wrote about different types of graffiti expressing different messages. Find some of those messages were against ULEX or KFOR. But they expressed the sentiment of people living in the north. A lot of that has been erased. And I get the sense from talking to friends and former colleagues that many people have left. They don't see a future in the north of Kosovo. And it's a great shame, because in my book about North Kosovo, I conclude with this, looking ahead and how will this community look and feel in, the next decade, 15 years, 20 years. And I feel that a lot of that progress that I experienced in 2015, 2018 has been undone. And I do have profound concerns about how that Serbian community in the north will look in in the coming years.
For those who don't know, your book is In Dragon's Teeth.
Dragon's Teeth, Tales from North
Tales
Kosovo.
from North Kosovo.
Yeah.
And today, when you look the security issue, it's still issue number one in Kosovo, even though conflict ended like almost 30 years ago. Can you explain, how can you explain the fact that international community still hasn't managed to secure better environments for people who live in Kosovo? How is that possible?
Well, I think a lot of issues have remained unresolved.
But this is issue number one.
Well, issue number, I mean, in terms of, if we look at the evolution of dialogue and the sort of, we call the sequencing of dialogue, I think one of the most fundamental things was the creation of the associational zajednica of Serb majority municipalities as a framework through which the functions that were established, operated, financed by the Republic of Serbia would be gradually integrated into the Kosovo framework in an orderly manner, because these are the services that people rely upon on a day-to-day basis. That has failed to move forward. It's been subject to fairly intense, what you could call propaganda, often compared to Republika Srpska, for instance, even though there's no similarity at all between the two models in the slightest. And so when you have unresolved issues and a settlement that is not being agreed upon, then you have an environment, and then you have a leadership which came to power in Kosovo who have almost been fixated on the north, and this battle to demonstrate that Kosovo has sovereignty over the north. And you lose the consent of the people. I mean, many of the issues about which we're talking began, prior to the withdrawal from institutions. I think the withdrawal from institutions has to be seen as a result of a breakdown in communication between the Serbs in the north and the central level institutions. And when you have a regime in Pristina that developed a sort of peculiar fixation with the north and demonstrating, that we can send special operations forces, it breaks that trust that existed and creates a security environment. Policing is very much about consensus. And if the local community don't feel that they have trust in their local police forces, then you see this in Northern Ireland in particular. I mean, the reason that UK police are not armed is because it's built upon a model of consensus. And I think that breakdown has become very problematic and creates space for a lot of security concerns and vulnerabilities.
In one of your articles, you said that the association of Serb communities is key to normalization. And today, when we have the other situation on the ground, a lot of Serbs moved from Kosovo, also a lot of institutions are closed. Is the association still necessary? And do you think that there is a need to form the association today?
No, I think it's still absolutely necessary. I mean, we still have on the table two of the main concerns of the Serb community in the north, health and education, that haven't been resolved. The associational zajednica provides a framework for how they can be integrated. It provides for transparent funding from Belgrade of those institutions. And these are the things that really, if you have a family in the north, you want to know how your healthcare is going to be provided, what your children are going to learn in school, and that's not to ignore other daily services on which people depend, and that's why it is so absolutely vital that this still be established. I realize the model falls short of what many Serbs would like to have, which is a more direct, essentially a third layer of government, which the association is not. But this model has been on the table now for over 10 years. And I think until we see any progress on the associational zajednica, it's very difficult to see how normalization can move forward, because of the existence of the Serb community in Kosovo is a big dimension of dialogue. It is not just a question of how we resolve the relationship between Belgrade and Pristina, but it's what life people and what opportunities Serbs will have in Kosovo, to have a community that thrives, that has a community that continues to feel safe and secure, to create an environment in where they can invest in business terms, in family terms, and that's key to the longevity of the Serb community.
As you mentioned, education and health should be integrated in association or community. And also in your book, in the chapter about university, you said that university is very important, especially for the north of Kosovo, because it brings fresh blood to Mitrovica and the north. So how do you see everyday threats that the education system and the university will be integrated into Kosovo system? Would it be the end of the university and the end of Serbian community in Kosovo?
Yeah, I mean, in the book I describe how Mitrovica is to many, in many senses, a university town. It might not have the aesthetics of when you talk about a university town, but thousands of students come to the north each year from different parts of the region, primarily from certain towns in Serbia. And they bring in their youthful energy. Of course, they bring in money, they rent apartments, they bring a certain vibrancy. Once upon a time, Trepča was the main employee, and, every family has someone who worked in Trepča, but now that is a moribund mine. It is the university that brings a sense of life to the north. I mean, you feel it in the evenings when you walk on, you feel it out of term when those young people are missing. And I think, if the university was to be, either again relocated or to be, further undermined and those, and students are deterred from coming, it would have a real tangible impact on the socioeconomic life of the north. Now, obviously, there need to be steps to try to regulate and find a sustainable solution to what happens when you get a degree from that university. And there are various options on the table. But I do believe that it would really be a great loss of vibrancy for the north. And there is a problem that to my mind, there's insufficient investment from the Serb community in the north in terms of opening businesses, creating economic opportunities, and obviously some would argue the environment is not ripe and healthy for that. But these are the foundations for the continuity of the Serb community in the north. Because, I think, obviously with the lack of a census, it's not easy to give clear figures. But, anecdotally, it seems that people are making a decision to live elsewhere. And if that trend continues, if you look at school enrollment numbers, I hear they're down. And those dynamics can accelerate very quickly. And, because when you have a family in the north and you start looking at, if there begin to be shortages of teachers or you can't rely on the healthcare system, then, that's the juncture where you consider whether you can actually sustain a future there.
But the university is not just the economic questions. You're writing about it. You have never seen so many young people in one place,
exactly,
like in Mitrovica.
Exactly. That's why I say it's a socioeconomic
all cities,
question.
not just from Kosovo.
It brings a sense of life. It brings in, it fills bars and cafes. It gives a sort of youthful energy that would be absent if the university was to be fundamentally undermined. So it's more than just paying for rent, or it really brings a sense of purpose for people. Getting human capital into places is extremely difficult. And, young people come, they learn about Kosovo, they experience, I think it has, other advantages that they take away. Because a lot of, this almost relates back to your first question, a lot of people talk about Kosovo, but have never had the chance to visit. And I perfectly understand there are hangovers in terms of concerns about security, but I think it would be long-term vital that more Serbs take the opportunity to visit Kosovo. I think on the whole the security situation is good enough for people to travel without risk, even with the Belgrade license plates, to take the opportunities to visit, Visoki Dečani or Gračanica. I think that would be an important step forward long-term. But, whenever I think on that front, we need to do more to try and open up Kosovo to, in terms of flows of capital, in terms, in the north you have 2 crossing points. When you travel, you end up queuing for 40, 45 minutes. I mean, having a border has tangible consequences. I think a new crossing point could be opened between the north and, leading into Novi Pazar. I think one could be opened in the south, helping Albanians travel to Bujanovac and Preševo and vice versa. So even though there's this impasse in dialogue, I think there could still be more done to promote trade and flows of people and ideas and, I think this would contribute to a better environment in which the more difficult decisions could be taken.
And when it comes to dialogue, what do you think about the new Brussels administration and the new mediator, Peter Sorensen?
Well, I don't envy them in the slightest. There hasn't been a great deal of progress in recent years. There is, of course, a new agreement that is supposed to provide the basis for how we move forward. But again, to my mind, in the absence of any progress on the association or Zajednica, there'll be no movement. And the current government in Pristina, we'll see what happens in forthcoming elections. There seems to be very little openness to negotiating how to move forward. So, yeah, they have an unenviable task. I mean, at a conference I attended, this week, someone raised a good point. What do you do when the mediator is more enthusiastic than the respective parties about resolving a problem? It creates a very peculiar situation where the mediator is not actually a mediator; they're more like a cheerleader, because the two parties are not looking for mediation. They're looking for someone to come in and be on their side and to sanction, and to try and use whatever tools at their disposal to move it forward. So I'm very, it's almost not about the personnel at this juncture. I think, the incentive structures are not there for parties. People talk about a new momentum on EU expansion, EU enlargement, but I'm not convinced that is the case. I see a lot of reluctance in certain European countries. I think if more far-right parties are going to come to power in coming years in Europe, maybe even including France, then they're not going to be open to further enlargement in the Western Balkans. And I think, a lot of politicians in the region sort of have internalized this. And so there's no incentive to make compromises, either side of the equation. So the mediator, Sorensen, doesn't have much at his disposal in that sense. Hence why, my suggestion would be to find, areas on the economic front, other fronts that you can move forward on, because the context at this juncture is fairly challenging.
If I understood, he's more a motivator than mediator.
Yeah, I think I said cheerleader, but he's. You have two parties who are not looking for someone to mediate between them. I mean, they're not looking for somebody to help them find, ways out of an issue, to find a solution, to help them work out how they could find a compromise. So in that sense, a mediator only works when you have two people who want to become, who want to try and find a solution to a problem. Otherwise, the mediator is the one who comes to Pristina or Belgrade and tries to encourage them to come back to the table. And all those personal relationships are broken down. A lot of the dialogue now is done between the respective parties and the mediator, not between the respective parties themselves, maybe at a technical level, but certainly not at a political level. So, this is a huge, we've gone backwards a long way from how dialogue used to be undertaken. So I have a lot of sympathy. It's a poison chalice at this juncture.
There are a lot of misperceptions and misunderstandings when it comes to Kosovo and Serbian-Albanian relations. What are the biggest mistakes of international community generally and the EU facilitator?
Well, the obvious fundamental one is not offering that clear path to EU membership. Back in 2013, this was the understanding that if you move forward with this agreement, you'll have a very tangible European future. I mean, I remember being in Serbia when people would talk about joining the EU in 2018 to mark the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. And that perspective has diluted such that it's going to take that big fundamental step to, bring whatever people understand to mean normalization. And some argue this is another failure, that normalization itself has never clearly been defined. Does it mean that Serbia recognizes Kosovo as an independent state? Or is it an accommodation whereby Serbia accepts that Kosovo will operate in the international sphere, and as one of the articles of the recent agreement says, allow Kosovo to accede to certain international organizations? Of course, it's not up to Belgrade if Kosovo becomes a UN member state. There are other countries who can veto
I'm not sure that we know what does the normalization
and that's the point,
means.
exactly. It does normalization, is it more of a sort of East-West Germany model where it's not fully fledged recognition, but there is an acknowledgement that the other party operates in the international sphere. And so I think that's you could see that as a weakness or as a strength, that ambivalence allows you to continue to move without putting pressure on one solution or the other, or one definition or the other. But some people do find it problematic that the ultimatum is not, or the distinct definition is not there on the table. So I think that's a failure. I think in terms of domestically, I think there has been I think there's also a failure to acknowledge that there are a lot of good positive dynamics that existed on the ground. Obviously, the last 2 or 3 years have done a lot of damage to what was going on at very specific local community levels in places like Goraždavac or Stupce, or people have common issues of concern. In Stupce, they want to build a vibrant tourist offering around the ski slopes and whatnot. And I think in the last decade, not enough has been done to try and take advantage of those dynamics. But someone said to me that the red line, or countries recognize Kosovo's independence on the presumption that Kosovo would be committed to being a flourishing multi-ethnic society. And if that commitment is not there, that those who've recognized Kosovo's independence should hold those governments to account, particularly this incumbent government in Pristina, for going back on that commitment. And I think the steps that we've seen in the last couple of years have gone a great way to undermining the sort of sense of possibility that Kosovo could exist as a multi-ethnic state. And I think more should have been done by the EU and by certain member states to remind Pristina of that undertaking. Because that, the steps that have been taken have undermined the very fabric of that. I mean, the things that I've been talking about in terms of people leaving, people won't return once they've left. And so, the dilution of that sense that the Serb community can live and thrive in Kosovo. I'm not saying it's been fatally undermined, but we are getting close. Certain friends of mine have used the term ethnic cleansing to describe what they feel.
Do you agree with them?
I'm not sure I agree. I think the problem with the term is it's very emotive, because we have, there are people in this region who have been ethnically cleansed at the point of a gun, or who've had, who've lost family members, who've suffered a more extreme way in which they've been forced from their homes. And I think using the term, in that sense, I think, you could say conditions that, I think using the term when you have people who've suffered, deaths in their families and personal suffering, personal injury, being forced from their homes, I think they would find the use of that term belittling of their own personal experience. And so for that reason, I'm apprehensive about the use of the term. And I don't think it necessarily helps. I think a lot of diplomats in Pristina are not necessarily sympathetic to the use of such language. I get a sense that they've become slightly almost turned off to when the Serb community raises grievances. Partly because they want also at the same time the Serb community to offer a positive vision for how they see the Serb community in Kosovo. And I think this is a big challenge for civil society, for politicians, to simultaneously raise grievances in a manner that engages people who are, based in Pristina and arguably more sympathetic to the majority population as opposed to the non-majority population. But at the same time to try to offer a positive vision for how the Serbian community could thrive in Kosovo in the future. That would be my sort of strategic communications advice, that those emotive terms don't reach the audience that that you might think they do. But in terms of, is the Serbian population declining and how much of that is attributable to the actions that are being undertaken by Pristina, I think that's a very valid debate. I just think finding the right, terminology can help reach a broader audience that might not automatically be sympathetic to the use of that language. It's the equivalent case is, you hear the term ethnic cleansing used with respect to Albanians in South Serbia when it comes to the passivization of addresses. And I don't find the terminology helpful in that context. I think, when you use these terms too much, you can dilute the meaning. I think making constructive, well-grounded, facts-based arguments will be more effective, and doing effective lobbying in Pristina or in different European capitals. But I think there's certainly a case to be made for, the sustainability questioning the sustainability of the Serbian community. For instance, in terms of language, in terms of, public sector recruitment, that there's good hard facts there that can be presented in terms of, economic investment, in terms of the security situation, how do the policing structures in the north represent the local population. There's a lot of very well-grounded arguments that can be made without, having to, I would caution against the use of such.
And theory on one side, the situation on the ground on the other. Do you think that Kosovo is a real multi-ethnic, multicultural society?
No, not yet. And I'm more pessimistic than I was that it can become. I think, it is incumbent upon the majority community to put in place the conditions to ensure that the non-majority community can thrive and feel that it belongs to Kosovo. Whether that be, as I said, in terms of language, in terms of public sector recruitment, in terms of how the issues of concern to the Serb community are handled. If you pursue issues unilaterally, then you can't claim to be acting in the best interest of that community. If you make it more difficult to use the dinar, if you make it more difficult for people to gain their social service, social benefits, if you make life more and more difficult. And the problem is that these things are happening, day by day by day. If there are very subtle things like, the number of police patrols you will find in the north vis-a-vis elsewhere in Kosovo. In terms of, how the number of times maybe the tax inspector will come and visit a certain business, or, the regulators will come. And these day-to-day acts, really ramp up the pressure and make it very difficult to run a business, very difficult to, as I said, if you can't get access to your entitlements, then it's very difficult to claim that you are part of a system that respects your rights. And I think what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years is really problematic from that point of view. It's the ongoing, and I find when I go to the north, people are always questioning what comes next. What is next? And when you're living in that environment where you wake up in the morning wondering what will happen to us today, I think that's a deeply unhealthy state of affairs.
Now we can switch to something lighter, easier. I mentioned that you have a new job. You're like a wine expert, right?
I wouldn't say I'm an expert. But,
Yeah, but how did you enter the world of wine? Was it before or after Kosovo?
I've been writing about wine for probably a good decade or so. Obviously I've always been a big fan of wine, but I actually find that what drew me is I see it more as a sort of dimension of travel writing in a way. It's the people and the stories and the history, as opposed to just the wines themselves. The personalities that you meet, the things you learn about a particular place. I always say to people I've been to, I know Serbia because of vineyards and national minorities. I used to work on national minorities in Serbia, and it's taken me to every sort of different geography. I think there's a lot of lost heritage in wine in the region. There's a very long and proud tradition. Obviously, during the times of socialist Yugoslavia, there was a lot of mismanagement and there was a lot of consolidation. A lot of family vineyards suffered. But, there's a real revitalization after the sort of, beginning in the 2000s. And, when someone welcomes you into their vineyard, of course, the famous Balkan hospitality, it's a real unique offering to have someone open their doors and to listen to their family stories, how they've inherited the tradition, and now how they're... It's just a great asset of, in terms of promoting, Wine Vision last week, in terms of promoting, the identity of, not just Serbia, but North Macedonia, Albania, and everything associated with it, the gastronomy, the sort of cultural heritage that's wrapped up in wine. I think it makes people talk very proudly about their countries. And, we all have this problem of finding something that we can be proud about in our countries. It can make us feel, we're always talking about the bad things that are going on, or the negatives, and, the traffic or the corruption or whatnot. But, this is something positive that you can convey to the outside world.
And how do you connect wine with the social analysis?
Yeah, because a lot of it is about tradition and heritage, and, how these things endure, how people safeguard their traditions, people who are now revitalizing grape varieties that were almost disappearing. It's an important reminder that these things are fundamentally important, that we mustn't lose touch of our, the things that our forefathers or, previous generations used to do, to maintain those traditions and those values. It's a connection with the land. It's an understanding of what went on before. I would prefer if Serbs drank a little bit more wine and a little bit less beer and lakia, but we can work on this over time. It's really about people and a lot of these winemakers are, they're artists in some sense. Some of them are almost, one-man bands. They're working on a tractor, and then they're in the vineyard, and then they're going to wine fairs, and they're, if they didn't exist, a lot of this land would fall into disuse. So I think, it's a reminder. Everybody talks about IT and all these, new tech and everything that is, forward-looking and attractive and, sexy in that sense. But I think, the real fundamentals the countryside is the backbone of the Balkans in many ways, and is going to die away unless, there is something that gives young people a sense of purpose. There's an association in the East, in Rajec, of young people who have taken these pivnicas.
Pivnica or pivnica?
It's pivnica.
It's not doublet, no?
It's not pivnica, it's pivnica, they told me. Taking these old stone houses, each of which has a cellar, and they're doing their own wine, and it gives them jobs. It gives them not everybody wants to come and live in Belgrade or Novi Sad or Niš. They want to come and they want to stay in their homeland. But if there are no jobs, traditional agriculture, I think, is less appealing for people. But wine is something that, I think gives you a sort of, gives you a broader perspective. So I find these people quite inspirational, because they might turn up to wine fairs with dirty fingernails, but they're really creating, out of nothing.
And finally, a symbolic question. If you had to choose just one sort of wine or variety of grape that reflects Serbian-Albanian relations and Belgrade-Pristina relations, what would it be? Something strong, complex?
If I say one grape from one country or the other, or more associated with Serbia or Albania, I'll get into trouble.
It doesn't have to be domestic?
No, it would have to be something like, I don't know, Pinot Noir.
Why?
Why? Because it's very difficult to grow. It fails quite often. It's very vulnerable to disease. If you're a winemaker, you really have to be attentive to it. But if you pull it off, it can be, it's the finest wine that you can have. And I think, relations between Serbia and Albania can be like Pinot Noir. They're going to take a lot of work. Particularly, relations between Serbia and Albania are actually, evolving quite well. I think when you don't talk about Kosovo, when you
I don't think Serbia and Albania like states, but Serbia and Albanian.
No, I still think, like Pinot Noir, if we get this sort of nurturing right, and we're attentive to all the potential diseases and risks and fungus and things that I think that there's potentially a lot of I'm still hopeful. But it's based on hope, though, not on, at the moment, not on expectation.
Do you like that wine?
I do, yeah. And I'd recommend it. And Serbia has some very good Pinot Noirs as well. But no, it's based more on hope rather than at this juncture expectation. But yeah, let's hope that we can raise a glass of Pinot Noir to Serbian-Albanian relation. I traveled recently through Kosovo on a consultancy and had the pleasure of visiting some of the communities I mentioned. Goraždevac, Stopce, we were in Mitrovica a few times. And when you talk to people at the local level, it does give you a sense of hope, because many local people living in communities face the same problems. They face the same uncertainties. They want the same things. And so if you can, the problem is it's very difficult to isolate those communities from what goes on more broadly. And I hope that there is a new government in Pristina in the forthcoming future, that there's less obsession with the north, that, you know, there's that commitment to internal normalization, whatever the relations between Belgrade and Pristina might be, and that vision or that idea of you know, a multi-ethnic, multicultural one that respects different languages and rights, and that it's upheld.
We don't have wine right now, but we'll raise glasses some other time. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you very much. Hvala puno.
A vama hvala na gledanju. Ostanite uz Kosovo Online.